70 vast prison camps stood silent in the Texas landscape, holding over 150,000 men behind barbed wire, a secret operation of staggering scale that most Americans still don't know existed. As Europe's prison camps overflowed with captured Axis soldiers, the U.S. government embarked on one of the largest prisoner relocation operations in modern history, transforming the Texas plains into a network of heavily guarded camps housing primarily German and Italian prisoners of war. This massive undertaking, occurring right on American soil between 1942 and 1946, represents one of the most overlooked chapters of World War II history. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. In early 1942, the tide of war was bringing unprecedented challenges to the Allied forces. As British, American, and other Allied troops captured tens of thousands of Axis soldiers in North Africa and later in Europe, a critical problem emerged: where to house these prisoners safely and humanely while adhering to the Geneva Convention. Great Britain, having survived the Blitz, but with its resources stretched thin, faced a particularly acute crisis. The island nation simply lacked the space, resources, and security to handle the massive influx of prisoners. Churchill's government made an urgent appeal to the United States. Would America accept responsibility for housing these prisoners across the Atlantic? The request landed on President Roosevelt's desk in early 1942. After careful deliberation with military advisors, he approved what would become one of the most remarkable prisoner transfers in military history. The decision was made with practical considerations at the forefront. America had the space, could more easily secure the prisoners thousands of miles from the European theater, and importantly, could potentially utilize prisoner labor to address critical wartime labor shortages as American men shipped overseas. By April 1942, the first ships carrying German prisoners captured in North Africa began their treacherous journey across the submarine-infested Atlantic. The U.S. War Department had been working furiously to establish suitable facilities. Texas, with its vast open spaces, existing military infrastructure, and climate that would not require extensive heating infrastructure, was identified as an ideal location for many of these camps. What few Americans realized at the time was that they were witnessing the beginning of an operation that would eventually see approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners housed on American soil, with Texas hosting the largest concentration of these camps. The first Texas camp opened at Camp Bowie near Brownwood in 1942. The War Department deliberately selected locations away from major population centers, but close enough to agricultural areas where labor would be needed. Within months, additional camps appeared across the state landscape, from the pine forests of East Texas to the arid plains of the Panhandle. Each camp was constructed according to standardized military designs, typically housing between 1,000 and 3,000 prisoners. The largest, at Hereford, would eventually hold nearly 7,000 men. These weren't hastily constructed internment facilities, but rather carefully planned compounds adhering to Geneva Convention requirements. Each main camp featured barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, canteens, shower facilities, recreation areas, and administrative buildings. Prisoners slept on regulation bunks with mattresses, blankets, and pillows. The camps were surrounded by dual perimeter fences topped with barbed wire, with guard towers positioned at regular intervals. Military police, armed with machine guns, maintained 24-hour surveillance. Most camps were organized into compounds housing approximately 1,000 men, divided according to nationality and sometimes military rank or political orientation. The standardized layout reflected the War Department's determination to comply with international law regarding prisoner treatment. As one War Department memorandum from 1943 stated, The United States will treat prisoners of war in its custody in accordance with the Geneva Convention, not only because required by international law, but because of the advantages accruing to our own captured personnel. Behind the bureaucratic language lay a practical reality. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were or would soon be fighting overseas, and many would inevitably become prisoners themselves. How Germany and Japan treated American POWs might well be influenced by how America treated Axis prisoners. This reciprocity principle became a cornerstone of American POW policy. The arrival of the first prisoners at Texas camps was met with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and sometimes hostility from local populations. Many Texans had sons fighting overseas, some already imprisoned or killed by the very nations whose soldiers were now arriving in their communities. Newspapers attempted to address public concerns. The Brownwood Bulletin reassured readers on May 12, 1943. These prisoners pose no threat to the community. They are heavily guarded, and the camp is designed to prevent escape. Moreover, many are simply ordinary soldiers who had the misfortune of being captured. For the prisoners themselves, arrival in Texas often came as a profound shock. After harrowing combat experiences, capture, interrogation, and then weeks crossing the Atlantic on crowded troop ships, often under threat of submarine attack, they faced a landscape utterly unlike Europe. Karl Munch, a captured Wehrmacht soldier who arrived at Camp Swift near Bastrop in 1944, later recalled, "We came from the cold, wet winter of Italy to this vast, hot place. The train seemed to travel forever through empty space. When we arrived and saw the camp, many thought it resembled the American Western films we had seen before the war." Another prisoner, Helmut Schmidt, no relation to the future German Chancellor, described his arrival at Camp Hearn in spring 1943. After weeks of uncertainty, seeing the organized camp was almost a relief. We were processed efficiently, deloused, given American Army fatigues with PW stamped on them, assigned bunks, and informed of camp regulations. Some men wept from exhaustion or relief. Others remained stoic. All of us wondered how long the war would continue and what would become of us so far from home. The War Department established a strict daily routine for the camps. Prisoners rose at 5:30 a.m. for roll call, followed by breakfast in the mess hall. Those assigned to work details departed after breakfast. The standard workday ran from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. with a break for lunch. Evenings were for recreation, educational activities, or relaxation before lights out at 10 p.m. Another roll call occurred in the evening to ensure no escapes had occurred. While the image of prison camps naturally evokes conceptions of hardship, the reality of life in Texas POW camps often contradicted expectations. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same quality and quantity of food as American garrison troops. In practice, this meant that many German and Italian prisoners ate better in captivity than they had during the latter years of military service, as Axis forces increasingly faced supply shortages. A typical daily menu included cereal, milk, fruit, and bread for breakfast, meat, vegetables, and dessert for lunch, and similar offerings for dinner. Captain Ernst Schrader, a Luftwaffe officer held at Camp Bowie, noted in his diary in October 1943, "The food continues to be plentiful and of good quality. Today we had eggs and bacon for breakfast, beef stew for lunch, and pork with potatoes for dinner. Many of us have gained weight. The Americans eat like this regularly? No wonder they grow so large." The American authorities also permitted prisoners to establish internal governance systems. Each compound elected a spokesman who communicated prisoners' concerns to camp authorities. Prisoners organized their own recreational activities, educational programs, theatrical productions, musical groups, and sports leagues. They published camp newspapers, formed orchestras, and even established universities within the wire where prisoners with specialized knowledge taught courses ranging from engineering to literature. At Camp Hearn, prisoners constructed a large outdoor theater where they staged elaborate productions. The camp orchestra at Fort Bliss included several professional musicians who had performed with leading European orchestras before the war. The quality of musical performances was such that American officers sometimes attended concerts, sitting segregated from the prisoners. The educational opportunities were particularly significant. At many camps, prisoners could continue their education through correspondence courses certified by international organizations like the YMCA and International Red Cross. Some even earned university degrees while in captivity. This system not only helped maintain morale, but was viewed by American authorities as supporting denazification efforts. Prisoners engaged in intellectual pursuits were less likely to dwell on Nazi ideology. Religious services were also permitted and encouraged. The Army provided Catholic and Protestant chaplains for prisoners, and in some camps with significant Jewish prisoner populations, primarily anti-Nazi Germans, rabbinical services were arranged. Military records indicate that religious attendance among prisoners was substantially higher than it had been during their military service, suggesting many found spiritual solace in captivity. However, life behind barbed wire inevitably carried psychological burdens. Letters from home arrived sporadically and were heavily censored. News of the war came primarily through American newspapers and radio, which prisoners often distrusted as propaganda. Many worried about families enduring Allied bombing campaigns in Germany or occupation in Italy. Uncertainty about the future weighed heavily. Depression, anxiety, and occasionally suicide occurred, though camp records indicate psychological issues were less prevalent than military authorities had anticipated. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of the Texas POW camp system was its work program. The original motivation for accepting prisoners had been partly economic. America faced severe labor shortages as millions of working-age men entered military service. The Geneva Convention permitted requiring enlisted prisoners, though not officers, to work in non-dangerous, non-war-related occupations. The War Department developed an extensive program that put prisoners to work in agriculture, food processing, logging, and various other industries facing critical labor shortages. By mid-1943, more than 90% of eligible prisoners participated in the work program. They received payment for their labor, 80 cents per day in camp coupons that could be used at the camp canteen to purchase tobacco, personal items, snacks, and beer, which was permitted in limited quantities until later War Department restrictions. This wage structure complied with Geneva Convention requirements while being carefully calibrated not to exceed wages paid to American soldiers. The economic impact was substantial. In 1944 alone, prisoner labor contributed approximately 13 million man-days of work to the American economy, with an estimated value of $80 million equivalent to over $1.2 billion in 2025 currency. Texas agricultural production, particularly in cotton and other labor-intensive crops, would have faced disastrous shortfalls without this labor source. For many farmers, the POW labor program proved a godsend. James Weatherford, who owned a large cotton operation near Huntsville, later recalled, "Without those German boys, we'd have lost half the crop in '44. My sons were overseas, one at Anzio and one in the Pacific. Most of the young men were gone. The prisoners worked hard, knew farming, and seemed glad to be out doing something instead of sitting in the camp." The work program also created unexpected cultural exchanges. Richard Spiegel, who was 16 when German prisoners began working on his family's farm near Fredericksburg, described the experience. "At first, we were nervous having the enemy right there on our land, but after a few weeks, we saw they were just men, many not much older than me. Several spoke German as my grandparents did. They shared photos of their families. One showed me pictures of his farm in Bavaria that looked remarkably like ours. It complicated things. They were supposed to be the enemy, but they seemed like us in many ways." Such interactions were technically forbidden by War Department regulations, which prohibited fraternization between prisoners and civilians. Reality in the field proved different. Daily contact between prisoners and American farm families inevitably led to conversations, shared meals, and occasionally friendships, particularly in Texas communities with strong German heritage dating back to 19th century immigration. Henrietta Kaufman, whose family employed prisoners on their peach orchard near Mason, described how cultural connections transcended wartime divisions. Many of the prisoners spoke the same German dialect as my parents. They recognized the German names on our mailboxes. One prisoner realized he came from the same village in Germany as my grandfather. By harvest end, my mother was sending extra food for our boys, as she called them. My father reminded her they were the enemy, but she just said, "They're someone's sons, just like ours fighting over there." Not all interactions were positive. Some communities remained hostile to having the enemy in their midst. Occasional protests occurred when prisoners were first assigned to local work details. In areas where many families had lost sons in combat, resentment sometimes boiled over. The Waxahachie Daily Light reported in September 1943 that a group of citizens assembled to protest the arrival of German prisoners assigned to the cotton harvest. Several carried signs reading, "No Nazi labor here," and "Our boys die while they pick our cotton." Military authorities typically responded by emphasizing the economic necessity and temporary nature of the arrangement. Security concerns naturally accompanied the program. Each work detail was supervised by armed American guards, typically at a ratio of 1 guard per 10 prisoners. However, the guard force primarily consisted of soldiers deemed unfit for overseas combat duty due to age, prior injuries, or other limitations. Their combat effectiveness was questionable, leading to occasional security lapses. Escape attempts did occur, though far fewer than military planners had feared. Department of Defense records document approximately 2,222 escape attempts from American POW camps throughout the war, with 302 occurring in Texas. The vast majority were quickly recaptured, often within hours. The Texas landscape itself proved an effective deterrent. Escaped prisoners faced vast open spaces, unfamiliar terrain, distinctive accents that immediately identified them as foreign, and often climatic conditions they were ill-prepared to navigate. Hans Gürmer, who briefly escaped from Camp Swift in 1944, was recaptured after just 9 hours. He later explained, "Where could we go? We spoke little English, had no civilian clothes, no money, and no contacts. And the countryside, so vast and empty. In Europe, you can cross borders in a day's walk. Here, I walked for hours and seemed no closer to anywhere than when I started." Some escapes became local legends. In perhaps the most audacious attempt, 7 German submariners from Camp Papago Park in Arizona made their way to the Salt River, where they had constructed a small boat, intending to float to Mexico and eventually return to Germany. Their vessel proved unseaworthy, and they were recaptured, wet and dispirited, shortly thereafter. The most successful Texas escape occurred in 1943, when Luftwaffe pilot Hannes Klein escaped from Camp Mexia and remained at large for nearly 6 weeks, surviving by stealing clothes, food, and eventually finding work on a farm where his broken English was attributed to his being slow-witted. He was only discovered when he became ill and sought medical treatment. Despite such incidents, the overall security record was impressive. By war's end, not a single escapee had successfully returned to enemy forces, and no acts of sabotage attributable to escaped prisoners were documented. More significantly, no serious violent incidents between prisoners and Texas civilians were recorded, despite hundreds of thousands of daily interactions through the work program. As the European war progressed, subtle changes occurred within the camps. The composition of the prisoner population evolved with the changing fortunes of war. The earliest arrivals were primarily from Rommel's Africa Corps, professional soldiers captured in North Africa in 1942-43. Many were seasoned veterans committed to the German cause, but not necessarily dedicated Nazis. Later arrivals, particularly after D-Day in June 1944, included younger, more ideologically indoctrinated soldiers who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule. This shift created tensions within the camps. American authorities, following established procedure, segregated prisoners according to their political beliefs. Those identified as anti-Nazi were separated from Nazi loyalists for their own protection. At Camp Hearn, for example, Compound 3 housed anti-Nazi prisoners, while Compounds 1 and 2 contained those with stronger Nazi sympathies. Similar arrangements existed at most Texas camps. The political divisions sometimes turned violent. Camp records document 149 assaults and 6 murders among prisoners in Texas camps, primarily resulting from political disputes. Nazi loyalists frequently targeted prisoners they viewed as traitors. At Camp McLean, prisoner Karl Richter was beaten to death by fellow Germans after rumors spread that he had cooperated with American intelligence officers. The perpetrators were court-martialed under American military law and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. American authorities grew increasingly concerned about Nazi influence within the camps. In response, the War Department initiated an ambitious re-education program in late 1944. Initially conducted covertly to avoid violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition against propaganda, the program became overt after Germany's surrender in May 1945. The curriculum covered American history, democratic principles, and critical examination of Nazi ideology. Prisoners attended lectures, watched documentaries about Nazi atrocities, and participated in discussions about Germany's future. The effectiveness of these efforts varied widely. Some prisoners embraced the opportunity for intellectual engagement after years of Nazi thought control. Others viewed the program as American propaganda and resisted. Lieutenant Johann Weber, held at Camp Swift, later wrote, "The Americans seemed to believe they could simply show us films and lectures and transform our thinking overnight. Some men played along to curry favor. Others remained committed to the Reich. Most of us were somewhere in between, exhausted by war, worried about home, and uncertain what to believe anymore." As 1944 progressed into 1945, the tenor of camp life changed dramatically. News of Allied advances, particularly after D-Day, affected prisoner morale. Some celebrated in secret, while dedicated Nazis insisted victory remained possible. The announcement of Hitler's death in April 1945 and Germany's subsequent surrender in May marked a psychological turning point. For most prisoners, it meant the war was truly over, and thoughts turned to eventual repatriation. Camp records note significant behavior changes after Germany's surrender. Disciplinary incidents declined sharply. Participation in educational programs increased. Many prisoners began actively preparing for civilian life, focusing on practical skills and languages. However, new complications emerged as evidence of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. Films of concentration camp liberations were shown in the camps as part of the re-education program. For many prisoners, this represented a shocking revelation, forcing painful reassessment of their nation's actions and potentially their own complicity. SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Albers, held at Camp Mexia, wrote in his diary after viewing footage from Dachau, "I cannot reconcile what I have seen with what I believed we were fighting for. If these horrors were committed in Germany's name, what does that make those of us who served? I cannot sleep. The images do not leave me." Not all responded with contrition. Some prisoners dismissed the evidence as fabricated propaganda. Others acknowledged the atrocities but denied personal knowledge or responsibility. This spectrum of responses mirrored the complex moral reckonings that would face German society as a whole in the post-war period. By late 1945, with the European War concluded, America faced a new challenge: the massive logistical operation of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The process began with Italian prisoners, many of whom were reclassified as Italian service units, after Italy's surrender and switch to the Allied side in 1943. Repatriation of German prisoners proved more complex, influenced by political considerations, labor needs, and the physical destruction of Germany. As autumn leaves fell across Texas in 1945, the first groups of prisoners began departing the camps that had been their home for years. The process would continue well into 1946, with the last prisoners leaving Texas soil in July of that year. For many, return meant facing a destroyed homeland, uncertain political status, and difficult questions about the future. What awaited them in a divided, occupied Germany remained unknown as their trains pulled away from the Texas camps where they had spent their war years, not in combat, but in an unexpected American captivity thousands of miles from the battlefields where they had surrendered. As the last transport ships carrying former prisoners departed American ports, the Texas camps stood empty, their purpose fulfilled. What would become of these facilities that had housed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers in the heart of America? And what lasting impact would this remarkable prisoner program leave on Texas communities, American policy, and the prisoners themselves who had experienced this strange wartime chapter? The answers would emerge in the months and years that followed, revealing unexpected legacies of one of America's least remembered wartime operations. The War Department faced a new dilemma as 1945 ended and 1946 began. The massive camp infrastructure created for Axis prisoners now stood largely empty. Decisions about the disposition of these facilities came against the backdrop of America's rapid post-war demobilization. Military budgets were shrinking, and maintaining empty camps made little financial sense. The specialized nature of prison compounds limited their civilian applications. Some camps reverted to their original military purposes. Camp Bowie, Camp Swift, and Fort Bliss returned to training and housing American troops, though on a reduced scale appropriate to peacetime forces. Others were repurposed for various governmental needs. Camp Mexia became a state school for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Camp Brady was converted to a TB hospital. Many smaller branch camps were simply dismantled, their materials salvaged for other construction projects during the post-war building boom. The most common fate was abandonment. Dozens of Texas camp facilities were declared surplus property and offered for public sale. Some found buyers interested in the land rather than the structures. Farming operations expanded into former campgrounds. In other cases, the facilities simply decayed, gradually reclaimed by the Texas landscape. Barracks weathered in the sun, guard towers collapsed, and fence lines rusted. Within a decade, many campsites were barely recognizable, the wooden structures reduced to foundations overgrown with mesquite and prairie grass. This physical erasure paralleled a curious psychological erasure in American collective memory. Despite housing over 425,000 enemy prisoners on American soil, a prisoner population larger than many major U.S. cities at the time, the POW program quickly faded from public consciousness. Several factors contributed to this historical amnesia. The program had been deliberately downplayed during the war for security reasons and to avoid inflammatory publicity. After the war, America's attention turned to rebuilding the emerging Cold War and the economic boom rather than dwelling on wartime operations. Most importantly, the program had succeeded without major incidents or controversies that might have embedded it in national memory. Its very success contributed to its forgetting. For the Texas communities that had hosted these camps, however, the impact lingered. The economic effects were significant, but temporary. Towns that had benefited from camp payrolls and supply contracts faced readjustment as these revenue sources disappeared. However, the broader agricultural benefits continued. The prisoner labor program had helped maintain agricultural production during critical wartime years, preventing farm failures that might have permanently altered the rural economy. Perhaps more significant were the cultural impacts. Many communities with German heritage experienced complex reconciliations. The presence of German prisoners had sometimes revitalized cultural connections, submerged by wartime anti-German sentiment. In communities like Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, and Comfort, where German was still spoken and German traditions maintained, interactions with prisoners occasionally strengthened these cultural ties, despite the wartime context. Martha Lehman, whose family emigrated from Germany in the 1890s and employed prisoners on their farm near Schulenburg, later reflected, "Before the war, we were proud of our German heritage. During the war, we were careful about showing it." When the prisoners came, we reconnected with our roots in an unexpected way. After they left, many families felt more comfortable embracing that part of their identity again, separating German culture from Nazi politics. For the prisoners themselves, repatriation meant confronting devastated homelands. Germany lay in ruins, its major cities destroyed by bombing, its economy shattered, its territory occupied and divided by former enemies. Many returned to discover family members dead, homes destroyed, and an uncertain future under occupation authorities. The contrast with the relatively comfortable conditions they had experienced in Texas proved jarring. Former Wehrmacht soldier Heinrich Müller described his return to Bremen in late 1946. "From the well-ordered American camp to this, my city was unrecognizable. Just rubble where streets had been, no running water, little food, suspicious occupation troops. In Texas, at least we had regular meals and intact buildings. Many of us wondered if we had been sent home or punished by leaving America." Some prisoners experienced particular difficulties reintegrating into post-war German society. Those identified as anti-Nazi during captivity sometimes faced suspicion from both occupation authorities, who questioned the convenience of their conversion, and fellow Germans, who viewed them as collaborators. Conversely, those who had maintained Nazi sympathies faced potential denazification proceedings and career limitations under the new political order. The American re-education program had aimed to prepare prisoners for constructive roles in post-war Germany. Evidence suggests mixed success. A 1948 survey conducted by American occupation authorities traced approximately 25,000 former POWs who had experienced the re-education program. The findings indicated that approximately 61% expressed positive views toward democracy and rejected authoritarian systems, while 24% maintained nationalist or authoritarian viewpoints, and 15% expressed no clear political position. A more tangible legacy emerged in unexpected ways. Many former prisoners maintained connections with the Texas communities where they had worked. Letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Some American families sent care packages to former prisoners struggling in post-war Germany. These human connections persisted despite the official end of the program and the onset of Cold War tensions. Perhaps most remarkably, dozens of former prisoners eventually returned to Texas, not as captives but as immigrants. Having experienced American life, learned English, and formed connections, they sought opportunities in the booming post-war Texas economy. Immigration records indicate that between 1950 and 1960, approximately 170 former POWs legally immigrated to Texas, often sponsored by farmers or businesses where they had worked during captivity. Walter Schmidt, captured in Sicily in 1943 and held at Camp Swift, returned to Texas in 1953. He purchased land near LaGrange and established a successful dairy operation. In a 1975 interview with the Houston Chronicle, he explained, "I came to Texas as a prisoner, but discovered my future home. When Berlin was blockaded and Germany's future looked dark, I remembered the open spaces and opportunities here. I wrote to the Bergman family where I had worked picking cotton. They sponsored my immigration. Now I am an American citizen, though one with an unusual path to citizenship." Similar stories appeared across the state. Former prisoners became farmers, mechanics, engineers, and small business owners. Most integrated quietly into their communities, their wartime status known only to close associates. Some married Texas women, raised families, and became fully assimilated Americans with unique dual perspectives on the war that had originally brought them to Texas as captives. This reintegration was far from universal. Many communities remained unwelcoming to former enemies, particularly in areas that had suffered high casualty rates. Werner Becker, who attempted to settle near Amarillo, where he had been imprisoned, faced such hostile reception that he relocated to Missouri. The Cold War heightened suspicions about Germans, particularly as tensions with the Soviet Union intensified and Germany became a front line in the ideological struggle. For military historians and planners, the POW program provided valuable lessons. The American approach, strictly adhering to Geneva Convention requirements, maintaining humane conditions, and emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment, became a case study in effective prisoner management. The program's success in preventing escapes, maintaining security, and even contributing economically while avoiding major incidents influenced future military detention policies. The program also generated significant intelligence value. While direct interrogation of prisoners was limited by Geneva Convention restrictions, the Army's covert monitoring program gathered valuable information. Camp authorities secretly recorded prisoner conversations, reviewed correspondence, and conducted discreet interviews with cooperative prisoners. This intelligence helped American authorities understand German military morale, technical capabilities, and internal political dynamics. Perhaps most significantly, the program's humanitarian standards likely benefited American POWs in German hands. While conditions for Americans in German stalags were certainly harsher than those experienced by Germans in Texas, historical evidence suggests that Germany generally maintained better treatment standards for Western Allied prisoners than might otherwise have occurred, partly due to reciprocity concerns. The contrast with the horrific treatment of Soviet prisoners by Germany underscores this point. As decades passed, the physical reminders of the POW camps continued to fade from the Texas landscape. Occasionally, development projects would uncover camp foundations or artifacts, prompting brief local interest. Few historical markers acknowledged these sites. The prisoners who had once populated these facilities aged, their first-hand accounts limited to oral histories collected by occasional academic researchers or local historical societies. In 1978, an unexpected development brought renewed attention to this forgotten chapter. Gottfried Hansch, a former prisoner who had been held at Camp Hearn, organized the first reunion of former German POWs on Texas soil. 23 elderly men, most now American citizens, gathered at the former campsite. Local media covered the event with curiosity. The Bryan College Station Eagle headline read, "Former German POWs return to Camp Hearn as tourists and citizens." Hansch explained the gathering to puzzled reporters. "We shared a unique experience that few can understand. For many of us, our time in these camps represented a turning point in our lives. We were enemies who became immigrants, then citizens. Our story is part of both German and American history, even if neither country fully recognizes it." The reunion sparked modest historical interest. Over the following decades, several academic studies examined the Texas POW program. Dr. Arnold Kramer at Texas A&M University became a leading scholar on the subject, collecting oral histories from former prisoners and guards before this generation passed from the scene. His 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, provided the first comprehensive academic treatment of the national program. Local historical societies in communities that had hosted camps occasionally mounted exhibits or collected artifacts. In 1995, the Gillespie County Historical Society created a small permanent exhibition about the Camp Fredericksburg branch camp, featuring photographs, prisoner crafts, and recorded interviews with local residents who had interacted with the prisoners. Nevertheless, this history remained largely overlooked in broader American historical consciousness. Standard American history textbooks rarely mentioned the program, focusing instead on military campaigns, home front mobilization, and the emerging Cold War. When prison camps were discussed in World War II contexts, attention centered on American POWs in German or Japanese hands or on Japanese-American internment camps, both critically important but distinct from the enemy prisoner program. This historical neglect persisted despite the program's scale. The prisoner operation required more personnel than the Manhattan Project, housed a population larger than Atlanta or Miami at the time, and was conducted across 46 states, with Texas hosting the largest concentration of camps. The extensive documentation in national archives and military records awaited researchers who rarely came. The turn of the century brought renewed interest, partly driven by age. As the World War II generation began passing away, historians and communities recognized the urgency of preserving their stories. The Texas Historical Commission launched a documentation initiative in 2001, surveying former campsites, collecting oral histories, and establishing historical markers at major camp locations. These efforts revealed how much physical evidence had disappeared. At most campsites, little remained beyond concrete foundations or modified buildings repurposed for other uses. Camp Hearn represented an exception where a local preservation society had protected portions of the original camp. In 2011, the Camp Hearn Visitor Center opened, featuring restored structures, interpretive displays, and artifacts from the camp's operation. Richard Smith, who spearheaded the preservation effort, explained its importance. This isn't just local history, it's national history that happened to take place here. Over 400,000 enemy soldiers were imprisoned on American soil during World War II, many right here in Texas. That's a story that deserves telling, not just for historical accuracy, but for what it teaches us about how America conducted itself even toward enemies during our greatest global conflict. The historical significance extends beyond physical sites to the program's place in American wartime policy. The POW operation represented a massive logistical achievement conducted with remarkable efficiency. It successfully balanced security requirements, economic benefits, and humanitarian obligations. The program's strict adherence to Geneva Convention standards reflected American commitment to international law even during existential conflict, a commitment that would be tested in later conflicts. Michael Williams, former Texas Commissioner of Education, who researched the program's educational components, noted, "What's fascinating is how America turned a problem, where to house thousands of enemy prisoners, into an opportunity." These camps became not just detention facilities, but rehabilitation centers, places where enemies could experience American values firsthand. Many returned to help rebuild Germany as democratic citizens. Others became Americans themselves. That's a powerful legacy. The program also holds lessons for wartime civil-military relations. Introducing enemy prisoners into civilian communities during an active conflict carried significant risks. The successful integration of the prisoner work program into local economies required careful management of public perceptions, security concerns, and economic needs. That this occurred with minimal incidents reflects effective governance during crisis conditions. For the communities that hosted these camps, the legacy is complex. The economic impact was temporary but significant. The cultural impact, particularly in Texas communities with German heritage, proved more lasting. The program created unexpected connections that transcended wartime divisions, humanizing the enemy through daily interactions that revealed common experiences and values beneath ideological conflicts. Former prisoner Hans Genther, who returned to Texas in 1957 and established a furniture business in New Braunfels, reflected on this legacy in a 1987 oral history. "When I arrived as a prisoner, I believed what our propaganda told us, that Americans were materialistic, decadent, and determined to destroy German culture. Working alongside Texas farmers, I discovered families not so different from my own, hardworking, religious, connected to the land. This experience changed me more than any re-education lecture could have. It showed the humanity behind the politics of war. This humanizing effect worked in both directions. For many Texans, direct contact with German prisoners complicated wartime stereotypes. Eleanor Bergman, whose family employed prisoners on their cotton farm near Navasota, described this evolution. At first, we expected to see monsters from the newsreels. Instead, we saw young men who looked like our own sons overseas. One played harmonica after work, songs that reminded my father of his childhood. Another fixed our tractor better than our regular mechanic. It became harder to hate them as a faceless enemy when they were right there at our dinner table, showing pictures of their families back home. Such personal connections reveal another dimension of the program's significance. Beyond military operations, economic impacts, or political re-education, the Texas POW camps created thousands of human encounters across enemy lines. In the midst of the most destructive conflict in human history, these encounters often revealed common humanity rather than irreconcilable differences. As the 21st century progresses, interest in this overlooked chapter has gradually increased. Academic studies, museum exhibitions, and documentary films have brought attention to the program. The 2001 PBS documentary, The Prison Camps of Texas, reached national audiences. Archaeological excavations at several campsites have recovered artifacts and enhanced understanding of daily life behind the wire. In 2004, Texas Tech University established the POW Oral History Project, systematically collecting accounts from former camp guards, administrative personnel, and local civilians who had interacted with prisoners. This initiative proved timely, as most participants were by then in their 80s. The project ultimately gathered over 200 interviews, creating an invaluable archive of first-hand experiences before this generation disappeared. Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, who directed the project, observed, "What emerged most clearly from these interviews was how the program transformed perspectives on both sides. Americans who worked with prisoners frequently remarked on the unexpected ordinariness of the enemy. Former guards noted how their view of Germans evolved from monolithic Nazi stereotypes to recognition of individual differences among prisoners. Local farmers described initial suspicion giving way to grudging respect for prisoners' work ethic and agricultural knowledge. One of the most revealing patterns in these oral histories was the frequency of maintained connections. Dozens of interview subjects reported correspondence with former prisoners continuing for years or decades after the war. Christmas cards, family photographs, and occasional visits crossed the Atlantic in both directions. These persistent human connections suggest that, at least on an individual level, the program succeeded in building bridges that survived the war's end and Cold War tensions. The program's impact on prisoners themselves varied widely, as revealed through German archives and memoirs published in later decades. For some, the Texas experience represented merely a safer interlude during wartime, preferable to combat but ultimately not transformative. For others, particularly younger prisoners or those with limited pre-war exposure to democratic societies, the experience proved genuinely life-changing. Former Wehrmacht soldier Peter Graubach, in his 1988 memoir From Stalingrad to Texas, wrote, "My captivity in America destroyed illusions about both countries. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as degenerate and weak. I discovered instead a powerful, confident society that treated even enemies with unexpected decency." Meanwhile, letters from home gradually revealed Germany's deteriorating situation and the regime's lies. By the time Germany surrendered, I had already experienced my own internal surrender to reality. For some prisoners, exposure to American race relations proved particularly disorienting. Having been indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, many were confused by America's contradictory practices. They observed rigid segregation in the Jim Crow South alongside the reality of black American soldiers guarding white German prisoners, a reversal of Nazi racial hierarchies that challenged their worldview. Luftwaffe officer Karl Fuchs, held at Camp Swift, wrote in a censored letter home in 1944, "The situation here regarding race defies simple explanation. Black soldiers guard us with guns, yet cannot enter restaurants where we are allowed to eat when on work detail. America's racial theories seem as complicated as our own, though differently applied." Such observations sometimes created cracks in Nazi ideological conditioning that expanded through the re-education program. The most concrete measure of the program's impact was the significant number of former prisoners who sought to return to the United States after repatriation. Between 1950 and 1960, State Department records indicate approximately 5,000 former German POWs legally immigrated to the United States, with Texas receiving the largest share. Many explicitly cited their prisoner experience as motivating their desire to return as permanent residents and eventual citizens. The story of Alban Meyer exemplifies this pattern. Captured in France in 1944, Meyer spent 18 months at Camp Mexia, working on nearby farms. After repatriation to Germany in 1946, he found his family home in East Prussia, now part of Soviet-controlled territory. Displaced and facing bleak prospects in divided Germany, he maintained contact with the Taylor family, where he had worked during captivity. In 1952, they sponsored his immigration. By 1960, Meyer owned a successful farm equipment repair business in Mexia, had married a local woman, and had 2 children in American schools. In a 1975 interview, Meyer reflected, "I came to Texas as Hitler's soldier and returned as an American by choice. In between was a journey through 2 worlds, the collapsed fantasy of the Thousand-Year Reich and the reality of American life I experienced even as a prisoner. I am still German by birth and culture, but American by conviction and gratitude." Similar stories appeared across Texas. Former prisoners became small business owners, farmers, mechanics, and tradesmen. Most integrated into their communities without emphasizing their unusual path to America. Many married American women, raised families, and became fully assimilated, though often maintaining connection to German cultural traditions. Their children grew up with complex identities, American by birth and upbringing, but with fathers who had once fought against the United States. James Weber, son of former prisoner Heinz Weber, who settled near Fredericksburg after the war, described this dual heritage. "Growing up in the 1960s, my father's war service was not something we discussed outside the family. My friends' fathers had fought for America. Mine had fought against it. Yet by the time I was born, he was more patriotic about his adopted country than many native-born citizens. He insisted on voting in every election after gaining citizenship and never missed a 4th of July parade." This integration was not universal. Cold War tensions complicated the status of German immigrants, particularly in communities less familiar with German culture than Texas. Some former prisoners who attempted to settle in northern or western states reported suspicion and occasional hostility. Even in Texas, acceptance varied by community. Those who settled in areas with established German heritage typically found easier integration than those in communities without such connections. The program's long-term impact on American military policy was significant, though rarely acknowledged. The successful management of such a large prisoner population under Geneva Convention standards established precedents that influenced later prisoner operations. Military manuals and training programs incorporated lessons from the World War II experience, emphasizing both security requirements and humanitarian standards. Colonel Thomas Raymond, who served at Fort Sam Houston, overseeing Texas POW camp administration and later helped develop Army detention policies, noted in a 1962 Military Journal article, "The World War II prisoner program demonstrated that adhering to international standards was not merely a moral obligation, but practical policy. Humane treatment reduced security incidents, facilitated camp administration, produced economic benefits through voluntary work programs, and likely improved conditions for our own captured personnel through reciprocity. These lessons should inform future conflicts. This legacy became increasingly relevant as America faced new detention challenges in later conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and post-9/11 operations. The contrast between the World War II program's strict Geneva Convention adherence and later controversial detention practices highlighted policy shifts that accompanied changing warfare types and legal interpretations. Military historian Dr. Robert Schultz, who studied the program's relevance to modern detention operations, observed, "The World War II POW program represented traditional prisoner management in conventional warfare between signatory nations. Nevertheless, the basic principles demonstrated in the 1940s remain relevant. Clear standards, proper treatment, productive activity, and rehabilitation focus generally produce better outcomes than harsh or ambiguous approaches." From a broader historical perspective, the Texas POW camps represent a distinctive example of how international conflict was managed on American soil, a rare instance where the distant war directly touched the American homeland through the presence of enemy personnel. Later conflicts introduced complications, guerrilla warfare, non-state combatants, and asymmetric threats that challenged established frameworks. While America's civilian population was largely spared the devastation experienced across Europe and Asia, these camps brought the human reality of the enemy directly into American communities. This proximity occasionally produced unexpected reconciliation, even during active conflict. Lutheran pastor Wilhelm Schroeder, held at Camp Hearn, received permission to conduct German-language services at a nearby church with historical German connections. His 1944 diary recorded, "Today I preached to a congregation of both prisoners and local German-American families. The military authorities required guards, of course, but for that hour we were simply Christians worshiping together, the war momentarily set aside." Several older congregation members spoke to me in the German of their parents and grandparents. They asked about places in Germany they had never seen but considered ancestral homeland. How strange that war brought me here to reconnect them with these roots. Such moments of human connection across enemy lines occurred throughout the program, creating thousands of small bridges between adversaries even as the wider conflict raged. These connections rarely appear in military histories focused on campaigns and strategies, yet they represent a significant dimension of the war experience, instances where individual humanity transcended national conflict. As the war generation passes from the scene, preservation efforts have taken on greater urgency. The Texas Historical Commission's Military Sites program has documented all known POW camp locations, establishing historical markers at major sites. Local historical societies in communities that hosted camps have collected artifacts, photographs, and oral histories. Academic researchers continue examining National Archives records containing the program's extensive documentation. These efforts face challenges. Physical preservation is difficult when little remains of most camp structures. Many sites have been redeveloped for other purposes, with few visible remnants of their wartime role. Public interest, while growing, remains limited compared to more prominent World War II topics. Funding for preservation and interpretation faces competition from many other historical priorities. Nevertheless, dedicated individuals and organizations have achieved notable successes. The Friends of Camp Hearn have developed the most extensive physical preservation, restoring camp structures and creating interpretive exhibits that attract several thousand visitors annually. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg incorporated the POW story into its broader World War II exhibitions. University archives in Texas have established special collections documenting local camp operations. Perhaps the most significant development came in 2018 when the Texas Historical Commission launched a comprehensive digital humanities project, Enemy Among Us, the POW Experience in Texas. This online resource compiled digitized photographs, documents, oral histories, and interactive maps documenting all 70 Texas camp locations. The project made this overlooked history accessible to researchers, educators, and the general public worldwide, ensuring its preservation beyond physical sites. Dr. James Williams, who directed the digital project, explained its significance. This represents one of the largest wartime operations conducted on American soil, yet most citizens have no awareness of it. By digitizing these materials and making them publicly accessible, we preserve not just the facts, but the complex human experiences on all sides, prisoners, guards, and civilians whose lives intersected because of global conflict. Their stories complicate simplified narratives of the enemy and reveal how individual humanity persists even during total war. As the final generation with direct memory of these camps disappears, the responsibility for preserving this history transfers to subsequent generations. The story of Texas POW camps offers valuable insights for contemporary society about wartime policy choices, about adherence to international standards even during existential conflict, and about human connections that can transcend national enmities. In an era of increasing global tensions, the program demonstrates both practical and ethical dimensions of prisoner treatment. It stands as historical evidence that humane treatment aligned with international law can serve national interests while maintaining moral standards. The program's success in preventing security incidents, contributing economically, and potentially improving treatment of American POWs through reciprocity offers lessons for modern conflict management. Beyond policy implications, the human dimension remains most compelling. Thousands of young men arrived in Texas as enemy combatants, experiencing American society from the paradoxical position of prisoners who often enjoyed better living conditions than civilians in war-torn Europe. Their encounters with Americans, guards, farmers, local communities, created unexpected connections across enemy lines. Some returned to help rebuild democratic Germany, while others eventually returned to Texas as immigrants, their wartime captivity transformed into voluntary citizenship. This remarkable story of enemies who became neighbors, and in some cases fellow citizens, offers a powerful counter-narrative to the dehumanization typical of wartime. In the midst of history's most destructive conflict, these camps became sites of unexpected human recognition, places where the artificial boundaries of national enmity sometimes dissolved through direct interaction, revealing common humanity beneath the uniforms and ideologies of war. The Texas prisoner of war camps stand as a testament to America's capacity to maintain humanitarian standards and rule of law even during existential threats. That this massive operation has faded from national memory speaks partly to its success. It was conducted efficiently, without major incidents that would have embedded it in historical consciousness. Yet the story deserves wider recognition, not merely as historical curiosity, but as demonstration of how enemies can be treated with dignity even during the darkest hours of global conflict. As the Texas landscape continues to transform, with former campsites disappearing beneath development or returning to nature, the human legacy endures through preserved memories, historical research, and the descendants of those whose lives were shaped by this unexpected wartime encounter. The fields where prisoners once harvested cotton under guard now grow crops for a peaceful world. The communities that once housed enemy soldiers behind barbed wire now rarely mark these locations. Yet in family histories, university archives, and historical collections, the remarkable story of when Europe's prisoners came to Texas and what became of them remains preserved for future generations seeking to understand the complex dimensions of America's wartime experience.